Vernon Haak was 58 years old on the morning of April 12, 1994, when he walked into the kitchen and told his wife Margaret that he wasn't going to sell. She was standing at the counter with her back to him, washing breakfast dishes in the sink. She didn't turn around. She just stopped moving for a moment, her hands still in the water, and then she asked him if he was sure. He said he was. She nodded once and went back to the dishes. His son David was 23 years old that spring. He was living in the upstairs bedroom of the farmhouse, the same room he'd grown up in, sleeping under the same sloped ceiling he'd stared at as a child. He had graduated from the University of Minnesota 2 years earlier with a degree in mechanical engineering and $62,000 in student loan debt. He was working nights at a fabrication shop in Mankato, 40 minutes from the farm, making $11 an hour and sending most of it back to the loan servicer every month. The development company had made the offer in March, $425,000 for the land, the house, the outbuildings, and the equipment. The farm was 280 acres, most of it flat and workable, set along a county road 12 miles south of St. Peter. The company wanted to build a distribution center. They said the highway access made it ideal. They gave Vernon 30 days to decide. David had done the math in his head the night his father told him about the offer. $425,000 would clear the remaining mortgage on the land, pay off the equipment loans, cover his own debt, and leave enough for his parents to retire without worry. His father was 58. His mother was 56. Neither of them had anything saved beyond the farm itself. David had watched his father's back stiffen over the years, watched him take longer to get out of the truck in the mornings, watched him favor his right knee when the weather turned cold. It seemed obvious. Vernon had farmed that land since 1967, the year he married Margaret. It had been his father's land before that, homesteaded in 1891 by a Swedish immigrant named Carl Haak, who came over with nothing and cleared the timber himself. Vernon's father had raised dairy cattle and corn. Vernon had switched to corn and soybeans in 1980, when milk prices collapsed and sold off the herd. The farm had survived the 80s barely, by selling parcels on the eastern edge to pay down debt. What remained was smaller but free of mortgage by 1992. Vernon ran a 1978 International Harvester tractor, a 1983 John Deere planter, and a grain drill he'd bought used in 1986. Most of it needed replacing. None of it would fetch much at auction. David didn't understand why his father hesitated. The family met in the living room on the evening of April 10th. Vernon sat in the armchair by the window. Margaret sat on the couch. David stood near the doorway with his arms crossed. Vernon explained that he had been thinking about the offer. He said it was generous. He said it was more money than he'd ever expected to see in his lifetime. He said he understood what it could do for David. Then he said he didn't think he could do it. David asked why. Vernon said he didn't have a reason he could put into words that would make sense. He said it just didn't feel right. He said he thought he had more years in him. He said he thought the land was worth keeping. David said the land wasn't going anywhere. Someone else would farm it. The soil would still be there. The only difference was that his parents would have money and security, and his father wouldn't have to work himself into the ground for another decade. Vernon didn't argue. He just sat there, looking out the window at the field that ran north toward the road. Margaret said they should sleep on it. David went upstairs. He didn't sleep. He lay in bed and listened to the house settle and thought about the fabrication shop and the loan payments and the $62,000 that hung over him like a shadow he couldn't step out of. He thought about his father's stubbornness. He thought about what it meant to choose dirt over money when money could solve everything. 2 days later, Vernon made his decision. He called the development company and told them he was declining the offer. Then he drove to the New Holland dealership in St. Peter and spoke to a man named Roger Lindstrom about buying a tractor. Roger had sold Vernon the grain drill in 1986. He was a short man in his mid-50s with a thick mustache and a reputation for honest pricing. Vernon told him he needed something reliable that could handle 280 acres of row crop work without breaking down every other season. Roger walked him through the lot and showed him a New Holland TM140. It was a 2004 model, blue and heavy, with a turbocharged diesel engine and a 16-speed transmission. The dealership had just taken it in on trade. It had 900 hours on it and no major repair history. Roger said it was the best machine he had for the price. He quoted $68,000. Vernon didn't have $68,000. He had $12,000 in savings, the equity in the old International, and the potential to finance the rest over 7 years at 8% interest. Roger ran the numbers. The monthly payment would be $970. Vernon said he'd think about it. He went home and sat at the kitchen table with Margaret. He laid out the numbers on a piece of notebook paper. The payment was manageable if the yields held and the prices didn't drop. It wasn't comfortable, but it was manageable. Margaret asked him if he was doing this because he wanted to farm or because he didn't want to let go. He said he didn't know. She said that was an answer too. On April 18th, Vernon went back to the dealership and signed the financing agreement. Roger shook his hand and said he'd have the TM140 delivered by the end of the week. Vernon drove home and parked the truck in the yard and walked into the house. David was sitting at the kitchen table eating a sandwich before his shift. Vernon told him he'd bought the tractor. David put the sandwich down. He asked his father if he understood what he'd just done. Vernon said he did. David said he didn't think so. He said his father had just turned down enough money to solve every problem the family had, and instead taken on more debt for a machine he didn't need to farm land he didn't need to keep. He said it was selfish. He said it was the dumbest decision he'd ever seen anyone make. Vernon didn't raise his voice. He said David didn't understand what the farm meant. He said David had never wanted it, and that was fine, but it didn't mean it wasn't worth keeping. David said keeping it wasn't the same as protecting it. He said his father was protecting his own pride, not the land. Margaret came into the kitchen and told them both to stop. Neither of them did. Vernon said David had spent 4 years at a university learning how to build things for other people, and he'd come back thinking he knew more about the world than a man who'd spent 40 years keeping something alive. David said his father had spent 40 years breaking even and calling it success. Margaret said David's name sharply. David looked at her, then looked at his father, and then he left the room. He went upstairs and packed a bag. He came back down 20 minutes later and told his parents he was moving to Mankato. He said he'd find a place closer to work. He said he'd be back for his things later. Margaret started to say something, but David walked out before she could finish. Vernon stood at the window and watched his son load the bag into the old Ford Ranger and drive down the gravel road toward the highway. Margaret stood beside him. Neither of them spoke. David didn't come back for his things. He called 2 weeks later and asked Margaret to box them up. She did, and Vernon drove them to a basement apartment in Mankato where David was renting a room from a coworker. David met him at the door but didn't invite him in. Vernon handed him the boxes. David thanked him. Vernon asked if he was doing all right. David said he was fine. Vernon stood there for a moment, then nodded and walked back to the truck. The New Holland TM140 arrived at the farm on April 22, 1994. Roger delivered it himself on a flatbed trailer. He and Vernon unloaded it in the machine shed, and Roger went over the controls and the maintenance schedule. He showed Vernon how to check the hydraulic fluid and how to grease the fittings and where the manual was stored under the seat. Vernon listened and nodded and asked a few questions. When Roger left, Vernon climbed into the cab and sat there with the engine off, his hands on the wheel, looking out through the windshield at the field that stretched toward the tree line. He started farming with the TM140 that spring. The planting went smoothly. The tractor handled the weight of the planter without strain and covered ground faster than the old International ever had. Vernon planted 280 acres of corn and soybeans in 12 days. The summer was dry but not disastrous. The corn came in at 138 bushels per acre. The soybeans hit 42. The prices were decent. Vernon sold enough to cover the loan payment and the operating costs and put a little aside for repairs. He called David once that fall to tell him the harvest had gone well. David said that was good. Vernon asked if he wanted to come out for Thanksgiving. David said he couldn't. He had to work. Vernon said Christmas then. David said he'd let him know. He didn't call back. Margaret tried calling him in December. David didn't answer. She left a message. He didn't return it. On Christmas Eve, Vernon and Margaret sat at the kitchen table and ate dinner alone. The empty chair across from them stayed empty. Margaret cried quietly after the meal. Vernon didn't say anything. He just reached across the table and held her hand. The next 5 years passed slowly. Vernon farmed the land with the TM140 and paid the loan every month. The yields varied. Some years were good, some years were break-even. The tractor never failed. Vernon maintained it exactly as Roger had instructed, greasing the fittings after every use, changing the oil on schedule, keeping the air filter clean. The machine became familiar in a way tools do when they're used every day. Vernon learned the sound of the engine under load, the feel of the steering when the ground was soft, the way the clutch engaged when he shifted from second to third. David stayed in Mankato. He moved to a better apartment in 1996. He got promoted to a supervisor position at the fabrication shop in 1998. He paid off half his student loans by 1999. He met a woman named Emily who worked in the office at the shop. They started dating in the spring of that year. Margaret learned all of this through David's cousin, who still talked to him occasionally. Vernon didn't ask for details. He just listened when Margaret told him. In 2001, David got engaged. Margaret found out from the cousin. She sent a card with a check inside. David cashed the check but didn't call. The wedding was in October. Vernon and Margaret were not invited. Margaret cried for 2 days. Vernon worked in the machine shed and didn't talk about it. The farm kept going. The loan payments continued. The TM140 accumulated hours. By 2003, it had 3,200 hours and still ran like it was new. Vernon replaced the rear tires that year and had the injectors serviced, but nothing major broke. The machine was reliable in a way that mattered more than efficiency. It showed up, it worked, it didn't quit. In 2004, David and Emily had a daughter. They named her Sarah. Margaret found out 3 months later. She sent another card with another check. This time David called. He thanked her. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. He didn't ask about the farm. Margaret didn't mention it. When she hung up, Vernon asked if David was doing all right. She said he sounded tired. Vernon nodded and went back outside. The years accumulated like hours on the tractor. Steady, unremarkable, relentless. Vernon turned 65 in 2001. He turned 70 in 2006. His back hurt most mornings. His right knee ached when the weather changed. He moved slower than he used to, but he still moved. Margaret worried about him. He told her he was fine. She didn't believe him, but she stopped asking. In 2008, the financial crisis hit. Commodity prices dropped. Credit tightened. Vernon's corn brought in $83 less per acre than the year before. The soybean price fell even harder. He made the loan payment in November by selling off a piece of equipment he didn't use anymore. He made the December payment by dipping into the savings account. Margaret asked him if they should think about selling. Vernon said no. By 2009, the loan was nearly paid off. Vernon had 3 payments left. The TM140 had 5,800 hours on it. The paint was faded in places and the seat was cracked, but the engine still turned over on the first try every morning. Vernon had replaced the alternator in 2007 and the starter in 2008, but the major components had never failed. He'd spent less on repairs in 15 years than he'd expected to spend in 5. He made the final payment in February 2010. Roger Lindstrom called him a week later to congratulate him. Vernon thanked him and said the tractor had been worth every dollar. Roger said he was glad to hear it. He asked if Vernon was thinking about trading up. Vernon said no. He said he'd run the TM140 until it quit, and he didn't think that was going to happen anytime soon. Margaret asked him that spring if he ever regretted the decision. He said no. She asked if he thought David would ever come back. He said he didn't know. She asked if it had been worth it. He didn't answer. David came back once in those years in the winter of 2011. He didn't call ahead. He just showed up on a Saturday afternoon in January, driving a newer Ford pickup with Emily and Sarah in the cab. Sarah was 6 years old. She had her mother's dark hair and David's eyes. Margaret cried when she opened the door. Vernon came in from the machine shed and stood in the doorway and looked at his son for the first time in 17 years. David said hello. Vernon said hello back. Emily smiled and introduced herself. Sarah hid behind her mother's leg. Margaret invited them in. They sat in the living room and drank coffee and talked about small things. David's job, Sarah's school, the weather. No one mentioned the farm. No one mentioned the fight. After an hour, David said they needed to go. Margaret hugged Sarah and told her she was beautiful. Vernon shook David's hand. David nodded and walked out to the truck. They didn't come back. Vernon kept farming. He turned 75 in 2011. He turned 80 in 2016. The TM140 kept running. By then it had 9,400 hours. Vernon had replaced the clutch in 2013 and the hydraulic pump in 2015, but the engine had never been opened. The tractor was 22 years old and still worked every acre of the farm. In March of 2016, David lost his job. The fabrication shop where he'd worked for 22 years closed down after the owner retired and no one bought it. David was 55 years old. He had a mortgage, a daughter in college, and no immediate prospects. He spent 3 months looking for work and found nothing that paid close to what he'd been making. Emily's income kept them afloat, but barely. In June, David called his mother. He said he needed to talk to his father. Margaret said she'd get him. Vernon came to the phone. David asked if he could come out to the farm for a few days. Vernon said yes. David drove out alone the following Saturday. He pulled into the yard and parked next to the machine shed. Vernon was inside, working on the planter. David walked in and stood there for a moment, looking around at the tools on the walls, the equipment lined up in the stalls, the TM140 parked in the back corner, with its tires still caked in last season's mud. He said he didn't know his father still had it. Vernon said he did. David walked over and looked at the tractor. He ran his hand along the fender. The paint was faded to a dull blue-gray. The decals were cracked. The seat was patched with duct tape. The steering wheel was worn smooth where Vernon's hands had gripped it for 22 years. David asked how many hours were on it. Vernon said 9,400. David shook his head. He said that was impossible. He said nothing ran that long without major problems. Vernon said this one had. David stood there looking at the machine. Then he asked his father if he'd been right. Vernon asked what he meant. David said the decision, the tractor, turning down the money, keeping the farm. Vernon didn't answer right away. He set down the wrench he was holding and leaned against the workbench. He said he didn't know if right and wrong mattered the way David thought they did. He said he'd made the choice he could live with, and he'd lived with it. David said he'd spent 22 years thinking his father was a fool. Vernon said maybe he was. David said he didn't think so anymore. He said he'd lost his job, and he had no savings and no backup plan because he'd spent his whole life thinking money and planning were the same thing. He said his father had taught him something he hadn't understood until he had nothing left to plan with. Vernon asked what that was. David said that some things don't survive because they make sense. They survive because you refuse to let them go. Vernon nodded. He said that was about right. They worked in the shed together for the rest of the afternoon. David helped his father finish the planter maintenance, and then they greased the fittings on the TM140 and checked the fluid levels. David asked questions about the machine, and Vernon answered them. They didn't talk about the years in between. They didn't apologize. They just worked. David stayed for 3 days. He ate dinner with his parents each night. He slept in his old room under the sloped ceiling. On the third morning, he told Vernon he'd found a job in Des Moines. It didn't pay as much as the old one, but it was stable. He said he'd be moving in 2 weeks. Vernon said that was good. David said he'd like to bring Emily and Sarah out before they left. Vernon said they'd be welcome. David brought them out the following Sunday. Sarah was 12 years old now, tall and quiet, uncomfortable in a place she didn't know. Margaret made lunch. They sat around the kitchen table and talked. After the meal, Vernon asked Sarah if she wanted to see the tractor. She said okay. He took her out to the machine shed and showed her the TM140. He explained how it worked, how the gears shifted, how the hydraulics lifted the implements. She listened and asked a few questions. Vernon answered them. Then he climbed up into the cab and started the engine. The diesel rumbled to life, loud and steady. He let it idle for a minute, then shut it down. The silence that followed felt heavier than the noise. Sarah asked if it was hard to drive. Vernon said it wasn't, once you got used to it. She asked if he'd teach her. Vernon looked at her, then looked at David, who was standing in the doorway. David nodded. Vernon said he would. They didn't leave until late afternoon. Margaret hugged Emily and Sarah. Vernon shook David's hand, then pulled him into a brief, awkward embrace. David didn't pull away. When they drove off, Vernon and Margaret stood in the yard and watched until the truck disappeared past the tree line. David moved to Des Moines. He called every few weeks. He brought Emily and Sarah back to the farm 3 more times that year. Sarah started asking questions about farming. Vernon answered them. In the spring of 2017, David asked if Sarah could spend a week on the farm during the summer. Vernon said yes. She came out in July. Vernon taught her how to drive the TM140 in the empty field behind the house. She was 13 years old, too young to operate it legally, but old enough to understand how it worked. Vernon sat in the passenger seat and walked her through the controls. She learned slowly, cautiously, with the same careful attention David had once shown when he was young. By the end of the week, she could shift through the gears without grinding them and steer a straight line across the field. On her last day, Vernon let her drive the tractor into the machine shed and park it in its stall. She shut down the engine and climbed out of the cab. Vernon asked her what she thought. She said it was harder than it looked. He said most things were. She asked if he'd let her come back next summer. He said she could come back anytime she wanted. Vernon turned 82 in 2018. His back hurt all the time now. His right knee barely bent. Margaret begged him to slow down, to hire help, to think about selling. He said he'd think about it. He didn't. The TM140 turned 24 years old that year. It had 11,000 hours on it. The engine still ran. The transmission still shifted. The hydraulics still lifted. Vernon had replaced the radiator in 2017 and the fuel pump in early 2018, but nothing catastrophic had failed. The tractor had outlasted every other piece of equipment on the farm. It had outlasted the International, the John Deere planter, the grain drill. It had outlasted most of the farmers Vernon had known when he bought it. In August of 2018, Roger Lindstrom died. Vernon read about it in the local paper. The obituary said he'd retired from the dealership in 2010 and spent his last years fishing and spending time with his grandchildren. Vernon went to the funeral. He sat in the back of the church and listened to Roger's son talk about his father's honesty and his love for the business and the relationships he'd built over 40 years. When it was over, Vernon walked up to the casket and stood there for a moment. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, then turned and walked out. David called that night. Margaret had told him about Roger. David asked if his father was all right. Vernon said he was. David said he was sorry. Vernon thanked him. They talked for a few more minutes and then Vernon said he needed to go. David said he loved him. Vernon said it back. It was the first time either of them had said it in 24 years. Vernon kept farming. The TM140 kept running. In the spring of 2019, Sarah came back to help with the planting. She was 15 years old now, confident and capable. Vernon let her run the tractor while he managed the planter. They worked together for 6 days and finished the whole farm. When they were done, Sarah asked Vernon if he'd ever thought about what would happen to the land after he was gone. He said he had. She asked what he'd decided. He said he hadn't. That fall, David came out alone. He found Vernon in the machine shed changing the oil on the TM140. David asked if they could talk. Vernon said they could. David said he'd been thinking about the farm. He said he knew he'd walked away from it, and he knew he didn't have a right to ask, but he wanted to know if Vernon had considered what Sarah had said. Vernon wiped his hands on a rag and looked at his son. He asked what David thought should happen. David said he didn't know, but he thought Sarah might. Vernon asked if David was saying what he thought he was saying. David said he didn't know what Sarah would choose when she was old enough to choose, but he thought she should have the option. Vernon asked if David had changed his mind about the farm. David said no. He said he still didn't understand it the way his father did. But he said he understood his daughter, and he understood that some things matter because someone decides they matter. Vernon nodded. He said he'd think about it. In December of 2019, Vernon went to a lawyer in St. Peter and had a will drawn up. He left the farm to Sarah, held in trust until she turned 25. If she wanted it, it would be hers. If she didn't, it would be sold and the proceeds split between David and Margaret. Vernon signed the papers and drove home. He didn't tell anyone what he'd done. The TM140 is still running. It has 13,000 hours on it now. Vernon still climbs into the cab every spring and plants the fields. Margaret still begs him to slow down. He still says he will, and he still doesn't. David visits every few months. Sarah comes every summer. She's 17 now. Last year, she asked Vernon if he'd teach her how to maintain the tractor. He said he would. They spent a week together in the machine shed, and he showed her everything Roger had shown him 26 years earlier. How to check the fluids, how to grease the fittings, how to listen to the engine and know when something was wrong. She learned it all. She wrote it down in a notebook. When the week was over, she asked Vernon if the tractor would still be running when she was old enough to farm. He said he didn't know, but he thought so. Vernon is 84 years old now. The TM140 is 26. Neither of them has quit yet. Vernon doesn't know how much longer he has. He doesn't know if Sarah will take the farm or walk away from it. He doesn't know if the decision he made in 1994 was right or wrong, or if those words even mean anything after 26 years. What he knows is this: the tractor still starts, the fields still produce, the land is still there, and his son came back. Whether that was worth $425,000 and 22 years of silence, Vernon couldn't say. But when he climbs into the cab of the TM140 on cold mornings and turns the key and feels the engine rumble to life beneath him, he thinks maybe it was. Not because it made sense, but because he refused to let it go.